The KNU and the resistance wants to make it clear that the military is the one that's responsible for helping essentially proliferate these kind of scam activities.
Hello, and welcome to episode 54 of What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. It's Friday, November 21, and on this fine day, we are going to be joined by Joseph Young, the daily briefing newsletter writer for Frontier Myanmar. He's going to talk about the latest in some of the big stories that have dominated the news this year. That's the scam industry and China's influence on northern Shan State, and China's support for the military regime at the expense of those resisting military rule and military atrocities. But before we get to that, let me quickly cover two key developments in the news this week. Updates on the so-called elections scheduled for next month and the latest in conflict around the country. First up, some low-level attacks and vandalism took place in Yangon this week related to the military's so-called elections, which are sure to result in a military proxy party, Union Solidarity and Development Party, that's the USDP, majority, and therefore will result in the installation of a continuation of military rule by other means. A resistance group bombed a USDP office in Mawby Township on Sunday, reportedly injuring 4 people guarding the building. Then on Tuesday, a group calling itself the Yangon Army took responsibility for a grenade attack on an administration office in Flergu Township that injured regime bureaucrats. And then another grenade attack on Wednesday back in Okalapa. That one also apparently injured administrators and pro-military militia members. A spokesperson for the Yangon Army told media outlet The Democratic Voice of Burma on Thursday, quote, "Administrators from that office have threatened residents who don't attend election campaign events. They're kidnapping young men and asking for money. That's why we did this." End quote. On Wednesday, the military regime sentenced 3 young men to 49 years of prison each for violating the regime's new, quote, law on the protection of multi-party democratic general elections from obstruction, disruption, and destruction. End quote. So what did they do, you might ask, to warrant such lengthy prison terms? Well, in September, they put up posters on the street that depicted the shape of a bullet superimposed on images of ballot boxes. These absurd prison sentences only reinforce the military regime's self-consciousness and fragility, and of course, betray the incredibly coercive nature of these supposed polls. Since this new election law was enacted this year, a total of 85 people have been charged with violating it. Their actions have been as simple as reacting with the wrong emoji to a Facebook post. And quickly, the new 2026 chair of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, is the Philippines, and its president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., has now appointed Foreign Affairs Secretary Teresa Lazaro as the new ASEAN Special Envoy on Myanmar. She said on Monday that the Philippines will continue Malaysia's 2025 approach to dealing with the Myanmar crisis, and she also addressed the military's planned elections, reiterating the Malaysian position that the deployment of observers to monitor the poll would require an ASEAN consensus decision. However, some member states have, over the last months, expressed support for the elections themselves. Malaysia, as chair, didn't really achieve anything this year, so a plan to follow in its footsteps is not particularly inspiring. And second, some territory has changed hands between the military and resistance forces in the last week. Resistance forces led by the Karen National Liberation Army, the KNLA, captured the town Maw Taung in Tanantari Township on the border of Thailand. Maw Taung previously served as the headquarters of the KNLA's Myat district until the military captured it way back in 1990. Dozens of military soldiers fled the KNLA attack into Thailand, and dozens more were taken prisoner. Around 1,000 civilians were reportedly displaced. While the KNLA has ceded key territory in Karen State recently to the military, it has extended its positions in Tanantari region since March. Remember, it also seized the border town of Tiki on May 9. The military is reportedly now preparing to attack and retake Maw Taung, which it could likely achieve if it does muster enough conscripts and is willing to deploy its air force as it's been doing elsewhere for the last several months. We will see. Then in Shan State, fighting raged on the road from Galay to Falam again this week, including many airstrikes. Falam, the town, still remains in resistance hands. This week also, the military abandoned the Mount Kennedy outpost near Tidim for reasons that are unclear. Resistance forces quickly moved in to take that outpost back. And then, slightly to the east in the lowlands, the military continued many attacks on resistance positions across Magway region this week in Pao, Nyain, Yasajo, and Sepiu townships. These included devastating airstrikes, including one on Thursday that killed 7 civilians and injured at least 20 in Nyain township. Tens of thousands of people remain displaced, particularly in Pao township, as military columns flush with conscripts. Some of these columns are over 250 people strong. As these columns march from farm to farm, at least 40 villages in Pao are currently emptied. And now, let's turn to our interview with Joe. Every weekday, Joseph Young gets a handle on the latest news, coordinates with Frontier's journalists, fact-checks, writes, and delivers the daily briefing newsletter to Frontier Myanmar members. These newsletters are the best way to stay on top of happenings in the country. So, of course, if you're not a member already, jump on the Frontier website and get involved. Now, there are 2 serious ongoing developments in Myanmar that I wanted to pick Joe's brain about this week. 2 issues that he's followed forensically for years now. These are China's influence on the Spring Revolution and the bumpy growth of the scam industry in Myanmar. In the news section of this podcast, I talk about these 2 issues just about every week. And these 2 trends, along with the military's so-called elections, well, they have really come to define Myanmar in 2025. So let's get into it with Joe Young, daily briefings writer at Frontier Myanmar. Hello, Joe.
Thanks for having me, Luke.
It's always a pleasure. So let's get started with the scam industry. Joe, you and Nick Dunlop published a Political Insider newsletter for members on Sunday about the recent raids and demolitions in the KK Park compound, titled Scam Raid Sham. Now, of course, if the scam industry in Myanmar was to be genuinely dismantled, the effects would be huge. The effects for everyday Burmese people and the foreign nationals that are working or indentured inside the compounds. And of course, the effects for the victims around the world who are defrauded out of tens of billions of dollars every year. Not to mention all the revenues that directly flow to the Karen Border Guard Force, the BGF, and to the Myanmar military. These revenues are for securing the compounds and renting the land. Now, you noted that analysts have been very skeptical about the military's raids on KK Park these past few weeks. So why is that? And now, what's happening this week in Shwe Kokko, another scam compound more directly linked to the Karen BGF and its leader?
Those analysts have a very good reason to be skeptical because the ties between the military and the Karen Border Guard Force are very deeply rooted, both financially and militarily. For one, these scam centers are possibly worth billions of dollars, and they serve as a very critical source of revenue for the BGF, an indirect extension of the military itself. In addition to those financial benefits, there's also the military angle. The reality is that the military strength in Karen State is quite tenuous and that has only grown since the 2021 military coup. And because of that, the military has grown increasingly reliant on the BGF to maintain order and control in Karen State. And that has only become more evident in the last several months. Since I think September, the military has actually made some pretty striking gains in Karen State. They finally retook control of the Kokorek Road to Myawaddy. They seized control of Lake Hall, and the KNU and PDFs in Karen State have largely been on the back foot. But the thing is that, according to a lot of Karen local media outlets, these gains were built upon the BGF's assistance to the military. And the junta now, more than ever, needs the BGF to be able to maintain these gains and be able to extend wider offensive in the regions against resistance forces. If the military were just to completely end the scam industry in Karen State, those billions of dollars worth of funding would dry up. Then the relationship between the BGF and Naypyidaw would be increasingly tense, which would very much call into question this kind of umbilical relationship between the two entities, and by extension, how can the military maintain its control over the vital sections of Karen State? Why would the military seek to dismantle these operations that essentially fund its war machine, right? And in terms of what's going on in Shwe Kokko, the military and border guard force raided Shwe Kokko on Tuesday, which it's important to note that Shwe Kokko serves as the headquarters of the border guard force. And, state media, including GNLM,
yes, the global new light of Myanmar,
made this big deal about the raid, showing they've arrested hundreds of foreigners, they seized computer equipment, mobile phones connected with the scams. But here's the thing is, before these raids even took place, the BGF spokesperson, Naimon Zaw, he already announced this raid is going to be taking place, so the scammers actually had advance warning these were going to happen. And Karen media outlets have even reported that a lot of the scam bosses already were escorted out of Shwe Kokko before the raids even began. And hundreds of alleged scam workers, I should say, already left Shwe Kokko before the raids even took place as well. So if this was a serious raid, why would the BGF give advance notice, right?
Absolutely. But you know what? It makes me think, when these raids by the military on the scam compounds in Karen State started, analysts said, this is just a performance for the reasons that you've already outlined. But then the military went one step further. They started blowing stuff up, destroying whole buildings, confiscating all this technology, a real escalation that you would think damages business. Money was invested in those buildings. It's much more of an impactful thing to do than to just go in, take photos, do a raid, then leave. But then people said, oh no, wait, this is just limited to small parts of KK Park. The buildings being destroyed there are tangential. The central part of KK Park is still standing. They're not going for other compounds like Shwe Kokko. But then this week, the military went into Shwe Kokko. Like you said, the BGF is part of this. Kingpins and employees had forewarning. But there's got to be something to this, right? The military has some leverage or some plan with the BGF, if not to dismantle the scam industry, that maybe to change the system. For a question, so could we see demolitions in Shwe Kokko too?
I think it is definitely possible because, of course, another angle to these demolitions and raids is the fact that the military is eager to assert control, especially ahead of the elections that are going to begin next month. Because for months, maybe even years, this area of Karen State has been outside the control of the military. And if it's not controlled by the PDS and resistance, it was being held by the BGF. And despite the BGF being under nominal command of the military, the BGF has for years been basically its own entity. It operates on an autonomous level. Like, it does what it wants. And for the first time since probably last year, the military has been able to drive the KNU and PDS out of significant parts of Myawaddy. For the first time in a long time, the military can actually put boots on the ground in places like KK Park and Shwe Kokko. And I believe the military is very keen to show that it is the ones in charge, not the BGF, but also to demonstrate to neighboring countries and the international community at large that stability is returning to the country, even though it's quite clear that the conflict will continue for years to come.
Right, you've brought up the international community there. Of course, China is the place where the current scam industry first developed at scale with Chinese victims. And the Chinese government pressured the Myanmar military and ethnic armed organizations to extradite criminals and stamp out scam compounds targeting Chinese citizens. They've done so for years now. This is part of the origin of Operation 1027 and, relatedly, the great hope of the Spring Revolution being able to threaten the military regime. But now the other global superpower is belatedly getting involved after about a year of sustained English language media attention on the scam industry in Southeast Asia. The United States has announced it's forming a task force to combat the scam industry. Apparently there are already Federal Bureau of Investigation agents embedded in Thailand. So Joe, is this a big deal that could generate quick results, or is it too little too late? Performative and more of a slow burn. What do you think?
Yeah, well, there's two aspects of this. One is that the issue of the scams has been building quite a bit within the United States itself. Ever since Operation 1027 and the scam gangs were driven out of northern Shan, a lot of them moved operations to Shan State. And they decided to focus on scamming English-speaking victims rather than Chinese to avoid the wrath of Beijing. Many of these victims are in the United States, and there's just been increasing stories of Americans being scammed online. I have seen even many of my friends back home talk about how they've been receiving all these suspicious messages. So the extent of, the scamming going on in the U.S. is quite widespread. And I believe there's been a lot of pressure building in the U.S. for the U.S. government to actually take action. So the announcement of the scam task force isn't quite a surprise, but I would say it's still significant because the U.S. has been quite slow to act in being able to tackle these kinds of transnational syndicates operating in Myanmar. And in terms of what it may affect on the ground I think that very much still is to be determined because unlike with China, the U.S. just does not have the kind of leverage and influence in Myanmar that China does. It has basically a non-existent relationship with the military, and it doesn't have much strong ties over ethnic armed groups. There's been some meetings that, between the resistance actors, including the KNU, and U.S. officials, but it's been very much superficial at this point. And it remains to be seen what the U.S. can do to actually crack down on scam centers. And to the point where even the other day, Zalmentun was basically mocking this task force, saying that it hasn't done anything. So it's too early to say what this task force will do, how much effect it will have, but it's very much a development to closely follow in the coming months.
Right. Zalmentun, for listeners unfamiliar, is the spokesperson for the military regime in Myanmar. And Joe, you mentioned there the lack of power, influence, and connection between the United States and actors in Myanmar when compared to China. But what the United States does have is decades of experience collaborating with Thailand. If we think back to Vietnam's American War, there were hundreds of thousands, possibly millions if you add them all up, of United States military boots on the ground in Thailand. And Thailand and the US still do military exercises. Thailand's relationship with the United States fundamentally shaped its trajectory as a modern independent nation state. So I wonder if the United States could get more out of working with Thailand than the way that China has been going about things on the scam industry.
Yeah, especially in the fact that this kind of Thai-U.S. cooperation really harkens back to the fact that, we're talking about scam centers now, but this kind of transnational crime syndicates operating in Myanmar, it's not a new issue by any stretch of the imagination. Even in the 1970s and 80s, the U.S. was trying to become more involved in combating crime gangs in Myanmar. But back then, it was about narcotics, especially in Shan State. And of course, that involved Thai authorities as well. So it will be interesting to see how much of that previous past of cooperation factors into what is happening now.
Okay, last question on the scams. So, Zalmentun, the spokesperson for the military regime, he's actually tried to deflect attention away from the Karen BGF and the military and said that the Karen National Union, the KNU, is responsible and benefiting from the scam industry. Of course, that group is one of the ones, along with the Kachin Independence Army, that the United States, has somewhat of a relationship with. And this week, the KNU has made a statement about all these developments and what's necessary to combat the scam operations. So what's this statement and how about the timing of it, Joe?
Yes, yesterday the KNU came out with its own statement, basically saying they're ready to cooperate with the international community to crack down on these scams. And the KNU has also repeatedly denied having ties with KK Park, including the accusations leveled by Zalmintun and the junta at large. Now with the junta trying to portray itself as being tough on transnational syndicates, the KNU and resistance at large likely feels it's even more imperative to show they are also going to be serious on cyber gangs. Because it's also an issue of legitimacy. On the end of Naypyidaw, the regime wants to portray itself as safeguarding stability on the border. But on the other end, the resistance wants to point out that the ties between the military, BGF, and these kinds of scam gangs and other illegal activity go very deep. The KNU and the resistance wants to make it clear that the military is the one that's responsible for helping essentially proliferate these kind of scam activities.
Thank you, Joe, for all those thoughts on the scam industry. Of course, we can expect more developments. This is a fast-moving issue at the moment. But now, let's switch over to the second topic I wanted to talk with you about, which is China's influence on northern Shan State and on the Spring Revolution. So China again produced big results in northern Shan State recently when it brokered a long-expected but still difficult to achieve ceasefire between the Ta'an National Liberation Army, the TNLA, and the Myanmar military. The TNLA agreed to cede Molmek and Mogok, two major towns, back to the military. But post-coup armed groups have been vocal about defending Mogok when the TNLA leaves the city. This uncertainty of whether there'll be a battle or not has led to an exodus of civilians. Now, the TNLA stayed quiet for a while, but this week they have declared they will escort the enemies they fought for so long, the Myanmar military, into Mogok. They'll escort them in and then withdraw. This puts their allies, the post-coup armed groups, the People's Defence Forces, in a really difficult position. What's at stake here, Joe? When will the Myanmar military have boots on the ground in Mogok? What would the consequences be if they strolled in and the PDFs walked away, or if there was a battle for the town?
Yeah, Mogok, I would say, is one of the most significant towns the resistance has seized since the start of Operation 1027. For one, it's probably one of the most populous towns that are currently under resistance control. And most importantly, Mogok is the center of Myanmar's ruby mining industry. And the industry is extremely lucrative and has been historically a vital source of revenue for both the military and ethnic armed groups. And getting rid of basically this cash cow is a very difficult sell for the resistance. And another important factor to keep in mind with Mogok and Molmek is that the TNLA did not seize these towns by themselves. They actually were heavily reliant on local PDFs to help them take this territory. And, of course, hundreds of PDFs either died or were injured taking these towns. For these PDFs to just be forced to withdraw because of the TNLA's peace agreement with the military, which sources have said that the TNLA did not inform the PDFs about the ceasefire in advance. It's a very big blow to these PDFs, to the point where it feels almost insulting. PDFs do not want to give up these towns for these exact reasons. And in terms of when we may see military boots on the ground, the military is projected to re-enter Mogok and Molmek at the end of this month, around November 30th, or up to December 1st. And there's a lot of uncertainty because of what you said. The PDFs have vowed to defend these towns. But there's a lot of questions is, will they actually defend these towns? Because if the TNLA is escorting regime troops into these towns, attacking these arriving military convoys would surely mean they're also attacking TNLA troops, which, if there's TNLA casualties due to PDF attacks, that will surely damage, if not completely break, ties between the TNLA and the PDFs, which have been very important in terms of training PDFs, arming them. And these ties aren't something that these PDFs can just throw away easily. But at the same time, just giving up, rolling over and giving these towns up to the military will also put PDF territories further at risk, because Mogok is quite inland compared to some more further parts of northern Shan like Sepal. And the military being able to reassert control over Mogok and Molmek would surely allow the military to penetrate deeper into PDF-controlled areas or areas of influence in central Myanmar, and possibly allow the military to have an easier time consolidating control over the center of the country. So there's a lot of writing on whether or not the PDFs go without a fight in Momek and Mogok.
While reportedly the TNLA did not inform the People's Defence Forces about the ceasefire beforehand, do you get a sense that now there are vigorous discussions being held between People's Defence Forces and the TNLA, or are they two separate cogs spinning in isolation?
Of course, as I alluded to earlier, the actual ceasefire itself, the TNLA agreed to this without consulting the PDFs. But there's been reports that the TNLA and PDFs have been engaging in discussions, with the TNLA making it clear that they are going to hand over the town to the military and they're going to escort regime troops back into these settlements. Because the thing is, regarding the TNLA escorting these troops, is it's not really a surprise that this essentially the stipulation was made. Because if the TNLA were simply just to basically abandon these towns and let PDFs just occupy them, it very much looked to the military like, and by extension Beijing most importantly, that the TNLA is not really respecting the ceasefire, and that essentially the TNLA is just allowing the PDFs to control these towns while it regroups. So being able to escort the military into these towns is basically, it's extremely vital for the TNLA to show it has goodwill in maintaining this truce. The question is, will the PDFs actually respect the TNLA's urge to essentially give these towns up without a fight? And there's big questions about whether that will happen or not.
Okay, now let's zoom out for a minute here to try and put this into context. So, Mogok and Mongmek, they're kind of to the west of what we call northern Shan State along the Chinese border there. And if we look at what's happened since the 2021 coup and Operation 1027, first we had China pressuring and brokering a ceasefire between the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, the Kokang Army, and the Myanmar military. That, resulted in ceding Lashio back to the military. Then we had the United Wa State Army coming out and admitting that they had been severely pressured by China to stop supporting resistance groups fighting military rule in Myanmar. That had a big effect as well on the revolution against military rule. Then we had the TNLA ceasefire, which we've already spoke of. All of this, of course, at the same time that China says it never interferes in other countries' internal affairs. And if we keep going west along the Chinese border, that brings us to the Kachin Independence Army. Of course, they're still ferociously fighting the Myanmar military in many locations, deeply bogged down in Bamor, almost a year now, heavy fighting in Pakant. And there have been rumours on again, off again, that the Kachin Independence Army would sign a ceasefire as well with the military. It's done so before, of course. But just recently, China has unilaterally opened border crossings that it's kept closed for a long time in Kachin State. These border crossings opening up immediately resulted in tangible outcomes like the price of cement in the Kachin Independence Army's headquarters, Liza. It halved straight away. So why did China suddenly do this? And what do you think about the prospects of the Kachin Independence Army also capitulating to military rule and signing a ceasefire?
Yeah, I think that, of course, the big thing about these rumors is none of them have been firmly substantiated. Because unlike with the TNLA and MNDA, the ceasefires that were brokered, between the military and the TNLA and MNDA, they occurred after several rounds of discussions of negotiations. And these negotiations were widely reported in Burmese media. So even though the sudden announcements of these ceasefires came as a surprise to people in the country and observers, the fact that they happened was not a surprise in itself. But we haven't had any such developments with the KIA and the military. And there have been no confirmed talks between the two as of right now. And in terms of why the border gates might have been reopened, that's a very interesting question because there is one thing the KIA has that the TNLA and MNDA do not have. That is the control over a vast, wide variety of rare earths. After taking control of the special Kachin region, which corresponds to northeastern Kachin, the KIA took control over much of Myanmar's rare earth mines. And that gave them such a very powerful bargaining chip because China would require the involvement of the KIA to get Myanmar's rare earth minerals. And that would be contingent on those border gates reopening. And one of the things that happened in the past several months is there's reports that the KIA was dabbling with the idea of helping the U.S. or India possibly transport rare earth minerals. And it's very possible that the pressure of wanting access to Myanmar's rare earth minerals was a factor in why China decided to open the border gates again. And in terms of what will happen in Shan State, is I foresee there will be more fighting in the future because unlike the TNLA and MNDA, the KIA has not taken control over the bulk of its claimed territory. Because with the TNLA, they control the Maw Taung areas. The Gokong control the mostly Chinese areas in northern Shan, but the same isn't true with the KIA. So the KIA has more reason to fight. Not to mention that the KIA has been deeply involved with the resistance since even during the early days of the coup. So, as for the time being, it seems unlikely the KIA will agree to a ceasefire with the regime in the near future.
Okay, Joe, thank you for those thoughts, and thank you for jumping on the program after a long, hard day of writing the daily briefing. We really appreciate it and look forward to talking to you again soon.
No problem. Cheers.
Well, there we have it for another episode of What's Happening in Myanmar. Thank you for listening right to the end. If you enjoy this podcast, you should also check out the other Frontier Myanmar podcast. It's called Do Atan. That means Our Voice, and it's focused on human rights reporting. It also does occasional video episodes, and you can see our latest one online at the Do Atan YouTube channel right now. Just type in DOHATHAN and check it out. Oh, and there's also some excellent original new reporting. Feature stories on the Frontier Myanmar website this week, including one about how Bangladesh has abandoned its plans to send more Rohingya refugees to Basan Char, a low-lying silt island in the Bay of Bengal that is vulnerable to weather events and was controversial from the get-go. Check it out on the website. Remember that you can email the show, whimyanmar@proton.me, and we love reading and responding to your emails. Until next week, take care and farewell.